Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of News from a World in Flux. I'm Charlie Gardner.
I'm Clare Farrell.
Lots to talk about today, as always. We're going to talk about a new report from the Office of Budget Responsibility, which gives some new figures about the costs of decarbonisation in the UK. Claire's going to talk a little bit about a conference she's recently attended in Europe with lots of people from across the climate movement talking about strategic priorities for our movement. That was really exciting. And we're going to talk about a huge court case which has just happened at the International Court of Justice just in last week of July. This case has caused a lot of excitement amongst the climate community. It was brought by people from Vanuatu, and they took it all the way to the International Court of Justice. And the court was asked to clarify two questions. The first was, what's the obligations of states with regards to climate change and the protection of nature? And the second is, what are the legal consequences when states have caused harm? And the court issued a very, very strong ruling, which says that states have a legal obligation to protect the environment and to minimise climate change. And this is really important for a number of reasons. Partially because the Paris Agreement doesn't impose legally binding emissions reductions on states. So if you remember we've talked in previous episodes about how the Paris Agreement asks every signatory country to put forward its own emissions reductions, its nationally determined contribution, its NDC. And under the Paris Agreement, these NDCs are discretionary. Countries can say, they can just choose how much they plan to emit by. But this ruling says that they shouldn't be discretionary. It's a legal duty. And so NDCs have to be compatible with they legally have to be compatible with meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. The other thing that I thought was really significant about this is that, the Paris Agreement doesn't really talk about fossil fuels at all. It talks about emissions, but it doesn't talk about where those emissions come from. So it's not really that powerful in arresting the drivers of climate change. Whereas this court ruling legally recognises the causal links between fossil fuels, climate change, and extreme weather. And obviously that causal link has been scientifically established for a long time, but it's never been legally established. And because of that, because of the legal responsibilities of states, it means that they could be sued by others if they don't meet their responsibilities, and legally be obliged to pay reparations. So it sounds like a really exciting thing. Obviously, there's going to be issues with enforcement and all the rest of it, but the framing of this comes from the International Court of Justice. It's a rights and justice based ruling, but the framing of climate justice isn't as simple and straightforward as we often talk about in the climate movement, is it?
No, exactly. And that's what I was just thinking about when this came out. I've started a Substack recently. I've been writing all these pieces recently to try and sort of think through in public what climate justice is. What does it mean? Do we even know? Can we get it? Would we be able to get it if we knew what it really was? Would that help? The abstraction of it, I think, has been quite unhelpful. But one of the things I've also looked into is kind of just thinking about whether or not an internationalist frame like this creates the sort of political conditions on a domestic level where you're set up to fail, because of course you're going to lose to reform in a poor community if you say, I know your skin, but we should be paying reparations to people in poor countries elsewhere, because the poor people in this country will say, well, it's not my crisis and it's not my GDP and I didn't cause this, and it's not my fault, and why should I pay, and all of this kind of stuff. So you can see how it's important for people to sit around these huge tables internationally and argue out arguments around justice between nation states, because that is precisely their job, and justice is so important. But it's that level of justice doesn't really reflect very easily into like a local community where you might be talking about climate impacts and who's got to pay for the adaptation or the cleanup or the fact that their houses are becoming uninsurable or whatever, on and on, price spikes in the food system. So it's quite complicated. And I think what's interesting about this from a sort of international level, I'm not sure it helps me much go to like a low-income community in the north of England and say, hey, like climate justice is important now because it's gone through the ICJ. What is amazing about this is that it's a legal recognition of the scientific facts. So it's not leaving us in a courtroom, for example, and I wonder what it's going to do for all of our court cases, right, in the climate movement. It's going to leave activists in a courtroom saying the International Criminal Court recognises that this is scientific fact, that it is a matter of globalised injustice, and that some people are responsible, and that fossil fuels are responsible, and some people are making profit out of being responsible for making it worse. And the people who are affected have got rights. So, I mean, I know, because I've been in court cases like this, that sometimes you go in armed with a load of evidence about the impacts in, I don't know, South Africa or famines in Madagascar, or, you know, you go into a courtroom in Britain having done some kind of non-violent action and you're on trial and you're saying, this is what's happening in these places, which is why I'm doing this, because it's caused here and it's doing that over there, kind of thing. But interesting to have something like this that's been signed off at that level, I think, to become part of the arsenal that activists have got to use when they go and confront things in the legal system. I also think it's like interesting legally, because talking with people through the course of XR and thinking about like the law, and of course the law is the way that we get justice in one sense, and people who've got a background in the legal profession saying things to me like, there is no way that the law can prevent the climate crisis because it can't act quickly enough and it can't change, given the nature of our circumstances is so different to what it was when the laws were written, and you would need like this massive consensus in politics to be able to legislate differently and to change the laws. And so the idea that the law at this high level, internationally agreed by all of these countries, I've got a list here, 15 judges from different countries, which includes America, China, Japan, India, Uganda, Slovakia, France, Somalia, Germany, Australia, Brazil, Mexico, Romania, South Africa, and Jordan. And the ruling was 100% unanimous between all of them that this was the right thing to do, and that there was a bolt-on statement from those judges saying, not, oh, by the way, we're feeling a bit wobbly and maybe we want to sort of water things down a bit, or say that we should let so-and-so sort of fossil fuel dependent country off the hook, but actually that they put like a sort of an extra document of their personal feelings saying that this actually we think could and perhaps should go further than what's on paper. So it can't be more bold, really, I guess, in terms of describing that it's an immense harm and irreparable injury to poorer states by richer states, basically, which is precisely the sort of question that I've got in my mind when I'm thinking about this question of climate justice, because the abstraction of the idea of the world's climate compared to the reality of saying, we know that we live in an economically unjust kind of global order, which is kept that way on purpose. It's by design. There is institutional support to keep it that way. It's very difficult for poor countries to get out of the bottom of that set of circumstances because of everything that is rigged against them. And everyone can see it for what it is in terms of the sort of the colonial whatever became the new neo-colonial present that we live in, that is a more substantial thing for a normal person to understand in terms of justice. Like, people need to be paid back some money they're owed. People need to be, people need to try and restore things when they've done a great harm or caused a great injury to another person or another state. That all makes loads more sense. So the idea that this also contains all this stuff about repair and paying people back reparations and being able to like recognise the rights of the people who are affected feels to me interesting, because the pace we're experiencing the changes at, I think, are, although it's absolutely horrific, are pushing the circumstances to a place where the law can help, because the law as we use it mostly looks back at something that's been done wrong and then asks someone to pay for it. It's not about prevention. It's usually about punishment. It's usually about a punitive dynamic. And so the fact that things are so fucking bad means that the legal system is starting to say, we need to understand how to use the usual kind of punitive mechanisms of the law to administer justice on this scenario. And it is a beautiful story as well, if you want to understand the kind of nature of the global nightmare, if you like, of trying to like form global agreements and get people around tables to push and push from sort of Kyoto through to Paris, through to whatever. Because actually, as I understand it, the idea for this came from Vanuatu, and somehow has managed to, like, an idea from a tiny, very vulnerable nation who's typically sort of on the global stage, you know, as many of those vulnerable states are, saying, please, could you agree to not eradicate my nation, right? That it's come from people who are usually so sort of having to form these big coalitions in the global space to say, like, we might be tiny countries, but there's a lot of us to form these kind of climate vulnerable huge blocks, that actually, you know, the idea of this can come from a country like that that's very disempowered in the global dynamic, and then ends up in the ICJ with this kind of ruling. It's like, I mean, it's a phenomenally beautiful story if you look at it in that sort of global context about the way that people can recognise their responsibilities to each other in these circumstances. I suppose my concern with it is that it sounds good, but I have no idea how all of this can then get enacted when we've seen the sort of the robustness of the opposition response to the kinds of action that's needed, and the fact that really we need to change the way that we live in a major way, not just the amount of stuff we all are using, resource consumption, all of this kind of thing, but that there's probably a rewiring of the economic models that we live by and the stories and the relationships we have, which I have no idea how a ruling like this can lead us to like restructure our economic narrative or our relationships to each other. But it certainly feels like it's a big crack in the sort of Leonard Cohen sense. It's a big crack, and it feels like it's letting a lot of light in for people. And I think some people are rightly sort of excited about it. So let's see. I mean, maybe there's possibility that people can see in this, which can reinvigorate the climate movement as a global entity, which I often think, you know, we're in XR anyway, we've been quite strong in places, but we have not been strong internationally, if you see what I mean. Like, XR is a global brand, but it's not coordinated at an international level in that way, if you see what I mean. If you think about things that have worked in the international space, like the Drop the Debt campaign, that sort of the power of that effort, you know, a global movement to end debt on poor countries by richer countries, you know, that was a global, it became a popular global concern, I guess, like at the time, at the peak of that sort of movement. You know, is this setting the scene for something like that to kick off and do something differently to what we've seen in the last sort of, like, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 10 years? I don't know.
It'd be really important that it does, because it seems like industrialized countries are becoming increasingly isolationist, retrenching from any sense of global responsibility. So we're seeing less faith in multilateralism. But another thing we've been seeing, I think, fairly across the board is slashing of international aid budgets and things. So Trump and Musk just destroyed the US Agency for International Development, which is a huge funder of global healthcare in the majority world, biodiversity conservation, other things. Other countries in Europe and elsewhere are, they haven't destroyed their international aid departments, but they are withdrawing funding from them. And that's accompanied, I don't know if it's necessarily triggered by, but it's accompanied by these right-wing narratives of, we don't owe anybody anything. We need to look after ourselves first.
Yeah.
And against that worsening trend of rich countries having a sense of, I don't know if it came from that sort of noblesse oblige thing, or just having a desire to contribute globally, if it's for soft power or whatever reasons. Rich countries did, obviously hugely inadequately, not enough to undo the damage they caused through systemic exploitation of other countries' resources and economies and stuff. But that is something that we've always had, that wealthy countries would contribute to global causes, and they're withdrawing from that now. So if this can spark a movement that starts to refocus on this notion of global responsibility, then I think that could be quite important.
Yeah, and I think, a rebalancing of things is one of the things that I've been writing about. Like, you can't expect to have a really good negotiation with somebody if, when you walk into the room, you are very clearly the main person who is like overwhelmingly and extremely oppressing them. Like, you're not going to have a good conversation with that person, right? One of the things that I've been thinking about with like what's going on when people are thinking and talking about climate justice is that I think it feels, to receive the message, like climate justice is the outcome you want. Whereas if the recognition is that the injustice is the cause of the problem, and it's partly the cause of the problem because people are like wildly polluting, like consuming tons of resources and, spiraling inequality and wealth and billionaire class, blah, blah, blah. Fine, we get all that. But also that on an international level, that the negotiations become very difficult because, some people have got like loads of resources and they're saying, well, it would be very difficult for my country to have less when they've got so much, and it's stolen and it's from slavery and it's from extraction and it's from entitlement and greed and colonialism, that actually, like, of course you can't go in and have a really good negotiation from those sets of circumstances. And so the justice part, the injustice needs to be sort of materially paid attention to in a much more I think easy to understand way. It's much easier to understand, right? We need more global equality so that we can deal with a global problem. I think that's a really simple thing, but I don't think that we've been managing to get that message across very well in the global kind of climate justice campaign space, if you see what I mean. It sort of feels to me like it's been quite, somewhat sort of fractured. There are some people who lead with that message, but there are other people who lead with other stuff that's much more about balancing out the responsibility for emissions, or contract and converge, that idea of people can grow, people can shrink, and then you somehow sort of meet in the middle and you all in good faith plan a way that your economies sort of align at some sort of like stable or like stabilizable position. That all of those sorts of ideas, I feel, that make it quite simple to understand that there's a need for some people to sort of step down and some people to step a little bit up, and then you sort of meet at some better place where everyone's much more equal. I don't really feel like that call has been clear enough, like I said, that you can imagine it surviving when you're in like street fighting politics against Richard Tice, right? Which I think, watching what's going on politically with Reform recently, and just to say about Tice, the Reform Party would want to make Britain a sort of rogue state like America is, which now, having said this ruling, makes America look like it's completely off on its own, pulling out of the agreements and going completely like snooker loopy, saying, well, drill, drill, drill. Like, that is a thing that now maybe you can see how, I don't know, it's either going to be helpful or not helpful, because people like Reform love to say, well, we should pull out of like human rights shit anyway because nobody cares about it, and we should like get away from Europe, and we should get away from international kind of restrictions and anything that puts anything on us as a responsibility from an international perspective. We're just automatically against it. But I do think it's, you know, it will be interesting to watch how if and how any of this can, you know, come into some kind of like meaningful relationship basically with the political context that we're dealing with in this country and other ones, with like what, like you say, that sort of slide to the right.
Speaking of Reform and Richard Tice, so one of the other big narratives that they are pushing very strongly, and of course they're not the only ones pushing it, the Conservatives too, Kemi Badenoch recently talked about this, is the narrative that taking climate action will be too expensive.
Yeah.
And it's a narrative that has been you know, quite widely rubbished with data, but it's a narrative that won't die. Yeah, they're really pushing it. It's not a surprise that Reform are pushing it. 92% of their funding comes from fossil fuels.
Wow.
Or from you know, from people who have fossil fuel investments. So their narrative that that decarbonisation will be too expensive is not a real one. It's an attractive one, because they can. It's one that they can sell to people who are concerned about the cost of living. But there was this report published by the Office of Budget Responsibility just this month in July, which again, it's nothing absolutely new because we know that decarbonisation pays for itself. But it was interesting because, you know, it didn't come from a body with responsibility for climate change. It came from a body with responsibility for overseeing government finances. The report wasn't about climate action. It was about all aspects of climate of government finances, but it had a chapter on the costs of net zero, and it found basically that the costs of decarbonisation will be much cheaper than we thought, and that's partly because of, you know, constantly declining costs of renewable energy. And so they found that 4 years ago, their estimate for the cost of decarbonising the country was £204 billion. It's now fallen to £116 billion,
Wow.
which is, you know, it's a little over half. So last year, the Starmer announced a £22 billion carbon capture scheme, which is, you know, it was a ridiculous scheme.
Controversial.
Very controversial. Controversial for a number of reasons, not least because it wasn't retrofitting carbon capture technology onto existing fossil fuel power plants. It was building new fossil fuel power plants with this shit. So, you know, it's an excuse to build more fossil fuels. But what really strikes me was the cost, £22 billion. I haven't seen a figure for how much nature restoration we could do for that money, and, you know, how much carbon we could absorb through nature restoration. But that's, you know, one big carbon capture power plant is 20% of the entire costs of decarbonising our economy.
Yeah.
Like, and that £116 billion by 2050, it comes to £70 per person per year. It's nothing. Like, how much of a bargain is that? 70 quid per person per year to decarbonise our society. I mean, fucking hell. And yet, this narrative that it will be too expensive just won't die, despite where these data are coming from. The other thing they found was that the impacts of not doing it, the costs of not doing it, will be much worse.
Yeah.
So this report didn't just calculate that decarbonising would be much cheaper. It also looked at the costs of not decarbonising, and they found that it would be hugely expensive. It would be costing, if we reach 3 degrees, it would be costing 8% of the economy by 2070. But actually, I find that figure extraordinarily low. I really struggle to imagine how our economy could still be 92% of the size it is now in a 3-degree world. And in fact, it doesn't tally with other figures we've seen recently. So in a recent episode, we talked about a report on fiduciary risk. It was a report by the insurance industry. They gave a worst case scenario for the hit to the economy in a 3-degree world, and it was well over half. Like, the economy will be half the size it is now. To be honest, no one knows what a 3-degree world will look like, but just intuitively, that feels more likely to me than an 8% hit in the economy.
It doesn't feel like a less than 10% change in the amount of money and resource that's like sloshing about, does it at all?
Well, one thing they didn't factor in was the costs of adaptation. So when they talk about the costs of the economy of inaction, that doesn't include the increased costs of having to respond to all these disasters and fix stuff after all these disasters, which would be much more expensive than if we had.
Yeah. The other thing, though, that is also worth paying attention to is that the carbon cost of rebuilding stuff that gets fucked up is really high. And so there is, I would love to look into this more, but I remember a little while ago there's a report from Aviva, the insurer, which was about the carbon footprint of restoring a home after a major flood event, where like everything's got to go and you need new floor and new furniture and new kitchen and new blah blah blah. And actually, if you have relentless disasters that you're like constantly rebuilding from, that is another like positive feedback loop in society, isn't it? Of like resource consumption to do all of this unnecessary repair work that shouldn't have needed to be done in the first place, but it's definitely
there's few things as polluting as concrete. Concrete is hard to decarbonize, and it gives off the production of it is just massive emissions. The stuff we're doing now in our transition away from fossil fuels is the really easy bit. The electrification, the producing electricity through renewables rather than fossil fuels. That's the low-hanging fruit. We can do that, and we're not doing it fast enough.
Yeah.
But decarbonising construction is really difficult, and that was already a massive problem before we had to constantly start rebuilding everything because it was getting destroyed with increasing frequency. So this news that decarbonisation will be much cheaper than we thought it's brilliant news, and it needs to be widely reported because we need to combat this false narrative that will be expensive. But I do think the costs of inaction have been underestimated, and that's even before we consider the other stuff we've talked about how climate will be worse than we thought and all the rest of it.
Given that Reform and Farage and Tice and others are becoming the political front for the fossil fuel sector in terms of their priorities and their connections and stuff, it is worth noting that there's a lot of people I know in the narrative space, the communication space, who are looking at how to find the most vulnerable points to go against them. And in case anyone missed it, and we can put the notes in the notes for this episode, but there have been loads of reports made about where you can hit their political position in a really effective way that takes it down. And a lot of people are saying, like, the majority of people don't actually think that everything's migrants' fault. The majority of people aren't xenophobic. The majority of people don't blah, blah, blah. And all of that is fine, but a much more ripe terrain to fight them on is their business interests and their friends and their connections. The fact that Nigel Farage, apparently, I heard the other day, owns 4 homes. He's just like you guys, working class people. He's just like you. The business interests that they're linked to. And interestingly, both, I think, Farage and Trump, a little less so maybe, but this idea that, one of the reasons why they're getting away with saying, I'm against the elite, is just because they're not that successful. They're a bit posh, they're a bit rich, they're a bit embedded in the system, but they're not like the Koch brothers. Do you know what I mean? Like, they're not up there with the big boys. They're actually kind of petty. And that means in some way that they get to come in and go, look, I'm just a trader, I'm just a blah, blah, and I'm somehow like the version of you that could be if you were just successful like I am successful. It's not got anything to do with the fact that I went to a posh school, that I had a leg up into like the metal exchange, that I've like had my dirty fingers in like lots of places where tons of money swings around, but that's where they're really weak. So a lot of their sort of fan base will be very anti-corporate. They will be very suspicious of business interests. They don't like the fact that corporatism runs the country. And actually, there's a real point of entry there, I think, particularly around where the climate movement overlaps with people that think that there should be more democratic ways of organising everything, but especially when you look at like corporatism, globalised corporations and big business. That feels like there's some real good work to carve out in that space, I think.
It makes a lot of sense to me that this is what the research is showing, that this is the lines on which to attack them, because they're essentially, they are fraudulent. Life's getting shitter for everyone, and everyone knows the system's fucked. Everyone knows the system is rigged for the 1%. And Reform and Trump and right-wing parties across the board are capitalising on this dissatisfaction with an anti-elitist narrative, except that they represent the elites. They represent the status quo. They represent the power that doesn't want the transformation in society, because they're the beneficiaries of the way things are now. And so they're outright hoodwinking their supporters, I think. And they've done it partly by reframing who the elites are. They talk about cultural elites, the environmentalists and the people in Islington that want to, take away your holidays. And they use it as a distraction from, the power of the economic elites. Yeah. I mean, it's difficult because people don't like to admit they've been hoodwinked. People double down on, no one likes to admit to themselves that they've fallen for a con man, but it is a con. It makes sense to me that exposing that is a powerful message. And particularly, if they're selling what on the surface of it sound like quite persuasive narratives that, wind farms will cost you money and they'll make you cold, it's difficult to battle information with information. It's difficult to say, actually, well, the Office of Budget Responsibility says that they won't cost you money, they'll be cheaper.
Don't want to listen to those elitists.
Yeah. But if instead you're saying, of course he'd say that, he's funded by the oil companies, that intuitively gets across, I think. And I can see that being a powerful message. And
I mean, I think also it's like the playbook, and I'm going to try and write something about this, but I think the playbook that I've seen through the think tank space goes from the denialist kind of space, where the tactic that was super effective was like, don't fight the argument, destroy the scientist, right? And we've all seen that, which is just basically a really simple strategy of refusing to engage with an argument that you might lose and instead destroying the person's sort of sense of self and their personality and who they represent, destroy their identity. That's what's been happening to the climate activist for the last 5 or 6 years in the press, like hardcore, intentional, international effort on that through many, many media outlets taking part in it. And actually some of the sort of more progressive, supposedly well-meaning media outlets just joining in with it as if they don't realise what it is, which I find very frightening. But anyway, right through to now, we can see people saying, well, actually, I would like to call you a terrorist. And that started with Extinction Rebellion in 2019, that paper, Extremism Rebellion. It was like, we don't like what this movement represents. We can see that they're serious. We can see they're successful. That's worrying because well-organised, disciplined non-violence that includes lots of grannies, when it's categorically right about something like this, will win, definitely. And we have to make a strategy against them. And I used to think that their strategies were quite complicated and like many-faceted, but actually I think I'm coming to the conclusion that it's actually not that complicated at all. It's just a spectrum of like, I'm either going to kind of smear and like slander you as a person, right through to like at the sharpest end, I'm going to get you defined as a terrorist. So it's just like either you're someone who people shouldn't like, or at the other end you're like a terror threat. And that's the strategy, to like hit against the people that threaten the business interests. And I'm interested in that because I think it's quite often something that people on our side don't want to do back. And obviously XR's got that sort of we don't blame and shame thing, which lots of people have found extremely useful. And I think there's a fundamental importance to it. But there has also been some impact from that where people have struggled to find the right language or the right route to really talk about accountability. And then also I think there's a lot of people who then perhaps don't find a way to counter the person, like the Farage character or the Trump character, who comes as like the face of this strategy to confuse and distract and grift and, you know, all of this stuff. We don't often find it very easy to go after them in the same way that they come after us, on a very, you know, ad hominem, personal, identity, blah, 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 whatever kind of level. So I'm going to write something about this because I just think it's like, the other day, you know, I have those moments where you go, oh my God, it's really simple. It's just a spectrum of either I hate you or you're like dangerous and you're a danger to the state and you should be locked up forever. That's the spectrum. That's it. And it's quite playground when you imagine it like that, isn't it?
Well, you're right, it is. But it's a strategy of narrative construction. Society has its underlying narratives. And the fossil fuel industry has spent so long and spent so much money creating this narrative where it is the good guy, right? They are the good guys. They power our lives. They keep us safe. And
you can't live without them.
They're part of the solution. So I saw this extraordinary statistic the other day from YouGov polling, and it's just testament to their narrative power. 51% of people in this country think we should use less gas. 62% of people in this country think we should use less oil. So we know that if we don't get off oil and gas, everything's going to be destroyed. 38% of people in this country don't think we should use less oil. And that's entirely because of the power of the narratives that the fossil fuel industry has created around themselves. Yeah, every time I don't watch a lot of TV because I don't have one at home, but every time I do, there's adverts there like BP, whatever, powering this country, powering the transition. They have painted themselves as the good guys. Now, the problem with our strategy, with not blaming and shaming and stuff, is that all the best stories have a bad guy. Yeah, having a bad guy creates drama. It brings you into the story. And the popular story told about climate change doesn't have the drama. It doesn't draw you in because it's a story that pits scientists and technicians against invisible gases, right? Yeah. So And invisible gases are not a persuasive bad guy. They don't get your blood boiling. You know, we're not fighting against climate change. We're fighting against the people who are stopping us from dealing with climate change, right? The fossil fuel industry's obstructionism is it's the greatest crime you can imagine. It could end up destroying everything. And the fact that we don't fight this narrative battle enough. I mean, we do. Lots of parts of our movement are trying to fight the narrative power of the fossil fuel industry. We've got, Culture Declares trying to make sure that heritage spaces and sporting institutions drop fossil fuel sponsorship. We've got others working to ban fossil fuel advertising so that they don't have that tool anymore. So we do fight these narrative battles, but I just think we need to be stronger at outwardly saying fossil fuels are the bad guys. It's just much more of a compelling message, I think.
Yeah. Well, and it's simple. I mean, that's also in these pieces that I've written about climate justice. There's a bit about Mean Girls, the film, where I basically got halfway through trying to put all my ideas down on paper and was like, watched Mean Girls with my mate's daughter. You know, I found it so amazing because actually it weaves directly into me thinking about how ideas about justice, behaviours, how all of this stuff is actually like, when you look at what's going on, it's easier than we think to just describe a type of behaviour that you recognise from the school playground that everybody knows is wrong, that is actually what's being done by leaders in business, by leaders in politics, by people on the international world stage, and how these sort of behaviours get perpetuated. And people know them when they see them. They're like, oh, nobody likes that person because they're a bully. People don't like that person because they're greedy, because they take more stuff than what's meant to be theirs. It's like very uncomplicated. And I think sometimes the analysis and the complication, the abstraction, the complexity of it can end up taking us to a place, like you say, where the simple narratives that's very easy to understand are like, don't feel like they're there to reach for very easily, because we're talking about something that's hugely complex. Actually, there's a real simplicity to it, and people know it when they see it. It's a bit like that scholar who recently wrote for the New York Times about what's happening in Gaza. Now, I'm a genocide scholar. I know when I see one, sort of thing. People know, actually, on a gut level sometimes, something that can get sort of, I don't know, whipped into all kinds of like complication, where we're going around in circles, but the simple thing is that person's doing something very bad and they need to be stopped.
The other thing I wonder might be partly behind that is we all recognise the power of emotion and the power of sort of triggering emotion in our communications. That's why we always talk about telling stories instead of sharing data and stuff, because we want to get people emotionally involved in this. But I wonder if there's a sort of reticence to sort of try and stir up or trigger what might be thought of as negative emotions, things like anger and a sense of retribution and stuff. Anger as an emotion doesn't have a good reputation. Anger's not good in lots of ways. But when I think about motivation, what motivates me, I'm partly motivated by love of the world and wanting to conserve as much as we can and to do the right thing. But I'm properly motivated by my fucking fury at these fuckers who have just happily willing to destroy everything. And I think that's really powerful. So Genevieve Gunther talks about this, how she cultivates her anger in order to motivate her in this struggle. She has practices where she literally cultivates it to use it. And people should be angry about the way things are. It's a horrendous injustice. And you know, the sense of injustice is a really, really powerful. I've got a whole bunch of young nieces and nephews now. They are obsessed. They are completely obsessed with everything being fair. You give something to, you know, you give a slightly bigger something to the brother than you do the sister. That's not fair. You know, that's not fair. And I'm going to kick up a right fuss about this for ages. They are so acutely aware of justice, and I think, yeah, many of us are. We feel this, but yeah, as a movement, we played nicely a lot, and we haven't tried to stir up anger against the people doing this. And you know, is it really bad to stir up anger against the people doing this? I'm not convinced. You know.
Yeah. Well, let's see. I mean, we've got some work to do to make sure that the 16-year-olds who may have a very keen sense of justice and not just watching Nigel Farage on TikTok and being dragged in the wrong direction politically. But I guess, you know. So,
I mean, that's a great example. By being reluctant to blame and shame within the climate movement, we're missing out on the opportunity to reorient that dissatisfaction towards the people causing it, rather than, you know, towards migrants and trans people.
Yeah, it's the politics of distraction, isn't it? Well, so shall I just give you a couple of headlines from this get-together in Leiden? Yeah. I went to the Netherlands to see a whole group of academics and organisers from mostly around Europe, but not all, but it was a very European type gathering. We met at a university venue. I stayed there for a week, which was, I'm not going to lie, I was a bit nervous. Maybe if you go and spend a week with a load of academics, it's going to be potentially interesting, but also potentially quite shit. And I was like, that's fair. And I was really pleased that it was good and interesting. And I didn't think, oh my God, I've got so much work to do. Why am I here? But the point of it was to sit together and say, okay, where are we now? What's the reality of our circumstances? We have an enormous amount of complex knowledge about the nature of what's going on and the problems. We're losing very, very hard on a global systemic sense. So taking stock and then looking at strategic priorities for moving ahead. When I get the documentation and the synthesis from some of the academics, I will share some of it, like through some of our notes in future editions. You know, there were all kinds of people there who've taken part in direct action, who've been part of movements, who've studied movements, who've looked at why they win, how they work, how they maybe don't work, and thinking about like different sort of directions we can push and things that maybe haven't been tried or thought through like hard enough. One of the things that I thought was really interesting, that was really strong there, was a sense that there's a climate populist need, which I know is like chimes with your feelings, but also we've talked about it before in the show and stuff like that. So there's a lot of like hunger to understand, to try and work through what a populist agenda or a potentially like mass popular agenda could be, that pulls climate forwards. And there's one person there who's very much thinking on that kind of systemic people don't trust and don't like corporations. There's an inhumaneness to them, and the fact that they obviously take up this kind of space in our societal structures and economic structures that is, well, they almost have a personhood. Why? Because people hate them and they're not people. They make decisions that no people would make collectively. So that's one kind of space of thinking like about the populist thing and the system push that maybe needs to be present with it. There were people there from a sort of economic background, so ecological economics, degrowth. I know that we're going to plan to like talk about that more another time. There were people there from a sort of movement studying background, and one historian that I met who I thought was really interesting, his view on fracturing elite alignment being like a critical tactic. And I don't think we try hard enough actually in terms of trying to see the weak points in the opposition and hit them where it hurts. And I know that's kind of what we've been dancing around just now, but we've not quite described it in that way so acutely. It's like there's such an incoherence to the thing that binds them that makes it feel like there's a powerful formation of this kind of nationalist right-wing, elite layer of players. And we have seen some of them falling out with each other quite publicly in quite a useful way. But there's probably much more that you could pay attention to there, particularly because their opinions don't make much sense anyway on their own often, but they definitely don't, there's not coherence and alignment and agreement. It's not a happy family. It just kind of looks like it is because they love power more than anything else, right? Yeah. And a paper that I'll put in the notes as well, which was something Julia had done, and I thought there's something really useful here about finding ways that people like us can be connected up to people like her and the other academics that were there, because actually they're doing relevant work that I don't see and would be useful to me. And as a climate person, Julia, having worked on contribution to the last IPCC report, which, as I understood it, had the first ever sort of segment about reducing energy consumption, which I'm like, wow, how could you get this far down the track? What, like 30 years and no one's ever written anything like, maybe we should use less energy. But she, having done that kind of work, she's written a paper which is about designing structures of ownership of assets so that you can lock the control and the ownership away from the profit-making potentiality. So it's basically trying to think critically about sort of cooperative models, ownership models that are different to just private profit-making models. How you design systems that have a firewall that keeps the ownership separate from the thing that brings in money, so that you can separate by design and keep it that way, so that you can lock things into more secure, more democratic ownership. And so I found it so interesting that focusing on the climate crisis leads you to something where you're going, we need to work out what are the technicalities that form the basis of a commons kind of framework or a cooperative a democratic ownership framework, because that is the thing that we need in order to deal with this crisis, which is a far cry away from, the invisible gases conversations, the global justice conversations, all of these other things. But actually, when you go down into the weeds of what are the technical things that we should work on, it's actually ownership as a concept. So there's tons of really, really interesting conversations that happened in that space. And, there will be a whole suite of shareable kind of syntheses of stuff which we can pull out and share later on. Hopefully going to be helpful for the movement at large, to sort of supportive materials that help us all to reflect on what we're doing, what we're not doing, what we might be not noticing, all of that kind of good stuff. So yeah, it was really wonderful to go away with them all.
Fantastic. I'm really pleased and uplifted. I'm sure all our listeners and viewers will be really uplifted just to know that these sorts of strategic conversations are happening, because we do need to be strong strategically, because our opponents are. So yeah, I look forward to hearing more from you about that in an upcoming episode, and I really, really look forward to doing an episode about different forms of ownership and commons ownership and degrowth. So do join us for another episode on that soon, and in the meantime, go and do lots of exciting things. Cheers.